How about now? There we go. So I've been interested in mapping Baltimore my whole life. I made my first maps of things in Baltimore when I was about 12. And in 2007, I did a project called Twitter Vision. And what I was interested in doing at that time was mapping out the social media usage in Baltimore. And if you know anything about Twitter in 2007, it was very early. And so the kinds of information that I was able to get was fairly limited. Mostly tweets, but I did get geography, and I got geography all around the world. And as a result of capturing this kind of live traffic on Twitter all around the world, the project got quite a lot of play. It went kind of global really quickly. It ended up in the Museum of Modern Art. But I felt like I still hadn't really answered the questions which I had set out to ask, which was, what are people doing with Twitter in Baltimore? How is Baltimore plugged into this kind of technology, and how can we use it to affect change? So what you see here, and I apologize for the lighting situation, but go ahead and click. This is Smaltimore. And we call Smaltimore because it's kind of a play on the idea that everybody kind of knows everybody else. And you're not going to be able to read these things, unfortunately, because of the lighting conditions. But what I can kind of give you a tour of is what happens around this edge. And each of these dots on here is a person. The colors represent communities of interest, and the lines represent follow relationships between them. So in the upper left, we have the suburbs and government. We got media and arts tendencies up here. Food and beer, that's a big one here in Baltimore. We got advertising, geeks, do-gooders over here, and the mayor, somewhere wedged between the burbs and do-gooders, okay? And when I talk about do-gooders, I'm talking about a lot of the nonprofit organizations, many of which we all have ties to. But my point is that if we actually look at what's going on in Baltimore, this Smaltimore piece is really only a small part of it. Next slide. That is Smaltimore in the context of Altimore. Everyone in Baltimore is this larger group here, and we're going to start to take a look at what is happening in each of these groups outside of the Smaltimore that we know. And Smaltimore is where we find all the things we expect to find, where we find the newspaper and the mayor and different businesses and restaurants and stuff. It's in all this that the rest of everybody else is living. Go ahead. So it breaks down into three rough chunks. And the way that I have broken these down is into Smaltimore, effectively Ravens Nation, also includes Orioles, but effectively all those people in the center only care about sports. They don't care about civics or hip-hop culture. And then the people up here, the DMV, they care about hip-hop culture. And the thing about the DMV, as a white person, I thought this was the Department of Motor Vehicles. Of course, I've heard of things like Delmarva and stuff. But the DMV is a specific term for the African-American community in the DC-Baltimore area that stands for DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Next slide. Now, we got a couple of little things to point out here. Mayor SRB down here in the middle of Smaltimore. Nothing to do with any of the rest of this. Baltimore Sun, same thing. Go ahead. Orioles, Ravens, Ray Lewis. What is that? 92Q Jams Baltimore. And then DMV followers. You've never heard of DMV followers. I'll tell you more about that in a second. And then go back. TEDxBaltimore, way down here. And then that's me, Dave Troy, way down in the far end. So what you see, go ahead and click, is that there's a spectrum here, and it basically runs from very white to very black and Latino. Next slide. So like anybody, I looked up on Urban Dictionary, okay, well, what do these people specifically mean by DMV? And what you find is this. This is the DC metro area. DMV stands for DC, Maryland, and Virginia. The whole DMV listens to go-go music, which originated in DC. We love North Face gear, Mambo sauce, and Chinese carryouts. We rep our hood to the fullest, because ain't no other place like us anywhere in the US. Our whole swag and slang and music and clothes is different from everybody else. I can go on and on about that, but I'm not. Where are you from? I'm from the DMV all day, 202, 301, and 703. And, so that's the kind of cultural identification that this crowd has. And you notice this DMV followers site has got 105,000 followers compared to the Baltimore Sun's 52,000 and Fox Baltimore's 23,000. This is a major media outlet, but it's just about the only thing that's reaching that population. Next slide. So if we take a closer look at the DMV, and again, I apologize for just not being able to make this out, but up here is where we've got this DMV followers guy. I called him up on the phone. He's a 23-year-old kid living in Atlanta. He spent some time living in DC, and he realized that there was a need for a media outlet to reach this broader DMV community. And now he's got a thriving business on his hands. He's doing the same thing in Atlanta. And basically he came to the conclusion that this was just an underserved market, and he's now making a lot of money by promoting things to this community. Next slide. So what I did was I ran a test to kind of see what people were talking about in each of these different communities on September 18th, 2 days ago. And I gathered a ton of data from all these different communities. And if you look over here on the left, that's the top hashtags. And on the right, these are the devices that people were using to post things to Twitter. Now, this is the Baltimore crowd. The Baltimore crowd is very web heavy. They use iPhone and Android in second and third place. Their hashtags tend to be things like now playing, talking about music, Baltimore Orioles, GMM, education, Maryland jobs, Ravens, Baltimore jobs. It's kind of plain Jane kind of stuff, you know. Next slide. Now, these are the most shared links in Baltimore on Wednesday and Thursday. I kid you not. The first was a few thoughts on cryptographic engineering from Matthew Green at Johns Hopkins University, who's actually speaking at TEDx Baltimore next month. But it's about the many flaws of dual ECDRBG encryption standards. You know, like, wow, the most shared link in Baltimore was a technical article on encryption. Somehow I'm kind of not surprised, but you know, it's interesting. Next thing. So another nice article from Education Week about how teachers are turning to social media to extend learning. That's nice. Next one. 9 ridiculous things in that BuzzFeed post about stopping mass shootings, LOL, you know, I mean, very typical kind of stuff. Next slide. And nice thing about Baltimore family bike party. So that's Baltimore on Wednesday. Next. Okay, so this is some of the faces and pictures, Twitter avatars from Baltimore. And this is just kind of a random sampling. I wrote this program to kind of give you a slideshow effect so you can kind of see. And you probably, if you're part of kind of the TEDx community, odds are you know many of these logos and people and different things, because these are the people that you mostly hang out with. So go ahead to the next slide. Now this was the DMV by contrast for September 18th. Totally different. Retweet is the top hashtag. Second most is team follow back. Third most, follow to be followed. Fourth most, titty follow train. I'm not sure what that is. Now playing, DMV, iOS 7, we love the V. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff, obviously, about music and culture that I'm not sure what it is. But as far as iPhone use, 51.7% is percentage of usage of iPhone. And that's like 3 to 4 times what it is for the Baltimore crowd. This is a very iPhone-heavy crowd, and the DMV followers guy that I talked to said that iPhone is definitely a status symbol amongst that community, and a lot of people strive to have one, and not just have one, but talk about having one. Next slide. So the most shared links here, I make this up not, it is the Hour of Gospel Swagger Radio is the most shared link on Wednesday and Thursday. A bunch of calendars for Melanie Iglesias. I'm not sure who she is, but she looks very attractive. And then a thing about dmvlife.com and people, music, culture stuff. So next slide. Now here's some, go back to there we go. Here's some of the faces of the DMV. And you can see that it's predominantly black, predominantly a little bit younger than Baltimore, but not exclusively black and not exclusively young. It's kind of a mix of people. And the point is, though, these people all closely identify with each other, and they closely identify with DMV more than they identify with DC or Baltimore or whatever. Next slide. Now, the Ravens Nation folks, this should come as no surprise. They're mostly talking about Orioles, Birdland Ravens, Buckle Back Up, Mazin Orioles, I Will, Crush, Browns, all these things that are obviously related to Ravens and Orioles primarily, but with some Redskins stuff thrown in. Also a very iPhone-heavy crowd, and decent amount of Android, a little bit of web, but these tend to be people, it looks like, that aren't tweeting from work. They're tweeting from mobile devices. Okay, so the most shared links among this crowd, nice photo essay on Ray Lewis at the Ravens site. Next one, Redskins blog site. Next one, Under Armour's page for whatever reason. They must have been running a promo or something. So if we want to look at these people, we can see that they kind of run the gamut. It's what I found geographically, because I do have geographic information for a lot of people, is that these folks tend to be a little bit more on the east side of Baltimore, a little bit maybe like Dundalk, Essex, up to like Bel Air, Harford County, that kind of thing. But that's kind of the realm that they tend to move in. Okay, next slide. The Pew Research folks did a report last year showing who's using Twitter. And I think a lot of people would immediately sort of have the knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, it's like tech people and people with a lot of money and stuff. And no, that's not the case. In fact, the most prevalent use of Twitter is amongst Hispanics. Second most is African Americans. And then third is white by almost half. In terms of geography, mostly urban and more women than men. Next slide. Now, the interesting thing that I kind of uncovered in digging through this is that the DMV network is about twice as big or more than the Baltimore network, yet it's about 5 times less dense. And what do I mean by less dense? It means that there's fewer interconnections between people in the DMV network than there are in this network. And you can see this as these blobs here, and you can see this more clearly in the real images, but there's a lot more people with lots of followers in the Baltimore network than there are on the DMV network. On the DMV network, nobody knows anybody, it seems. It seems like they're struggling really hard to make connections, hence all the stuff about retweets, follow back, trying to figure out ways to broadcast a message to a wider group, plus, things like DMV followers that clearly indicate a need for greater connectivity. But what I started to wonder was, with this roughly 5 times difference in distribution or density between these two networks, why is that? Is there some maybe practical reason for that? And the first question that I asked was, could it have something to do with transit? And if you haven't seen it, there's a site called magnificent.net that lets you plot out a travel shed for a given point in space. And one of the things you notice when playing with Magnificent is that East Baltimore and West Baltimore are sort of mutually exclusive in terms of public transportation. That is to say, you kind of can't get from East Baltimore to West Baltimore via public transportation. And I wonder if that doesn't have some dampening effect in the creation of physical, real-world social networks. Next slide. So what I wanted to ask by looking at Washington, D.C. was, well, there's a city with a lot better transit. Could things maybe be a little bit different there, or does it look about the same? And what I found, this is kind of a preliminary map, but if you're familiar with DC, you can probably pick out a few things that you notice. But the first is that the DMV still constitutes 49% of the DC social network. It's huge, and there's a couple of people that seem to have a lot of followers. There's this guy, David Castaigne, who proclaims himself to be the Sultan of Swag. I don't know him, but he sounds cool. DMV followers, once again, DMV Nation, Top Flight 100, some other guy who seems to have a lot of swag. And then over here, Corbett 3000, many of you in the kind of geek tech scene might know Peter Corbett. He's off on the edge, as are all we in Baltimore. We tech geeks like to think we're in the middle of things. We're off on the edge. You got Barack Obama, pretty squarely in the middle of things. I was heartened to see that. That's nice. Mayor Vince Gray, pretty much in the equivalent of Baltimore. I'm calling it small DC. And then over on the far end, instead of having like a big sports problem, they have a politics problem. And so there's a whole bunch of people that are pretty much dedicated only to talking about politics. And that's kind of what you'd expect in DC. But the interesting thing is, once again, these densities hold up. It's 0.007, which is the same as in Baltimore for DMV and DC, and 0.020 for the sort of small DC, and then 0.034, which is very tightly dense for the politics network. And I think the thing that we see here is that it's hard to say why this density is so low still. With a very big community and a lot of people using it, and here's a city with good transit, I'm not sure why the density is still lower, but I think that's something that's worth asking about. Next slide. So that's kind of what I have right now. And for those of you that know, I've been mapping out Facebook and LinkedIn and a variety of other data, and just within the last few weeks that I have the kind of insight to figure out how to get at the Twitter data. But one of the ways you can help is by going to twitter.peoplemaps.org and contribute essentially your credentials, which enables us to mine data faster from Twitter, which is helpful. And I'll be publishing more on this and asking more questions. I'm trying to build up a community of people that's interested in examining this data and trying to understand it better. But I think that there's some really interesting questions posed here. And I think the thing that kind of comes back to me again and again when I look at this data is that we've been trying to make the city better by mapping out things like race and geography. And in fact, those are really crude proxies for what we're really after, which is communities. So now that we starting to have better data that tells us about communities, explicitly about how communities function and how information flows, isn't it incumbent upon us to stop relying so much on techniques that haven't proven to work very well in terms of mapping and look at some other newer techniques of mapping communities? Thank you.